Welcome back, everybody, to another edition of Western Civilization 2. Today we're going to be looking at the new imperialism, 1870 to 1914. Our focus question is going to be, how did the late 19th century surge in imperialism, particularly the scramble for Africa, reshape global political dynamics, economies, and societies? And what are its enduring legacies? So grab a pen and paper, a tablet or keyboard, and let's get going. So what I want to begin with is what is often called the Great Divergence. And this is a relatively new historical term that's been coined by a historian recently. And essentially what this means is that, well, what it refers to is the divergence between Europe and some of the other parts of the world that had traditionally either been ahead of Europe industrially or neck and neck with Europe industrially. The argument is that beginning in the late 18th century and particularly in the 19th century, is that Europe, because of the Industrial Revolution, began to outpace places like Asia or India or Latin America, wherever we're talking about, that Europe's economic growth for a variety of factors really accelerated at this time. And that right up until about 1800, Europe didn't hold any real decisive advantage in terms of productivity over and against some of these other places. But the argument goes that if we look at this chart, places in East Asia, certainly Latin America, Middle East, places like this, they stagnated. They had some economic growth, possibly even a little bit of decline, at the very time that Europe was really beginning to industrialize very rapidly. And so this, as we're going to see, is going to have some pretty profound effects. Another significant factor in the early part of the 19th century is the growth of the free trade movement. This was particularly strong in Britain. We've talked about this to some degree earlier when we talked about Adam Smith. You may remember him as the economist who advocated for laissez-faire policies, free trade, and the like. The early part of the 19th century is actually remembered as kind of an anti-colonial era. For instance, the colonies of Spain and Portugal were all getting their independence. The United States had gotten its independence at the end of the 18th century. It was a time when the idea of freedom in Europe itself was a very popular sort of idea. And so the early part of the 19th century, driven by Britain, is remembered as a period of time when a lot of these barriers began to come down, economic barriers. So as Spain lost its colonies and Portugal lost its colonies, it lost the ability to put tariffs and it lost the ability to put barriers against outsiders, particularly Britain. At the same time, Britain was undergoing the Industrial Revolution itself. It was looking for new markets and new peoples to sell to, and so they very much embraced this. Without Spain protecting its colonies from Britain, the British would be able to sell goods there. It was a big issue in the United States, and so this was a time when Britain was really pushing this ideology and opening up new markets around the world. Though this is often remembered, the early part of the 19th century, as a time when colonialism was on the retreat in much of the world, this was not the case in India. Britain was simultaneously expanding its control over the Indian subcontinent. They had first gotten toeholds in the uh, they'd first gotten toeholds in India as far back as the 17th century, but they had really begun consolidating control over the continent at the end of the 18th century and early part of the 19th century. By 1857, the British had more or less extended their control over much of South Asia. This was going to have the effect of causing deindustrialization in India at the same time that Europe was industrializing. So let me explain how this works. Throughout much of the ancient and medieval period, and right into the early modern period, India was a world leader in cotton manufacturing. Using traditional hand tools like looms, Indian manufacturers were able to crank out cotton cloth at a reasonable price, fulfilling not only domestic needs but also exporting to other parts of Eurasia. As the British began to consolidate their control, though, they recognized that India was a source of cotton. And so they began to export cotton from India back to England. In England, this cotton would be manufactured using industrial technology. It would then be exported to the rest of the world, but especially to India. British manufacturers recognized that India's big, sprawling population was an ideal market for this cloth that they were producing. Naturally, Indian peasants using hand tools couldn't keep up with advanced British manufacturing technologies, though. This began to decimate the native Indian weaving industry. Soon, virtually the entire industry had been gutted. Indians with hundreds of millions of people were buying from the British. At the same time, Britain was expanding agricultural production of cotton, so turning lands that had been used for other things like food and whatnot into cotton fields to fulfill the expanding demands back in Great Britain. And so, at the same time Britain was industrializing because of British policy, India was deindustrializing and going from an industrial economy back into an agricultural economy. From their home base in India, the British were also able to begin to penetrate the Chinese market. Again, the British were looking for new markets and peoples to buy their goods from. Unfortunately for them, the Chinese market operated under very restrictive rules. So the British were very interested in acquiring things from China, particularly tea. So some of the best tea in the world is grown in China. But the Chinese weren't interested in much that the British produced, leading to a massive trade imbalance. They would accept silver, but the Chinese were not interested in buying Britain's industrial manufacturers. This caused a great resistance in Britain. So for one, they weren't happy about silver being siphoned off to China. And secondly, British manufacturers felt that it was unfair that the Chinese would not let them enter into their markets and sell their goods to the huge Chinese population. strictly controlled. And so they came up with a workaround. From their base in India, the British began to produce opium in large quantities. They knew that there was a market in China for opium, which was illegal, but there was a market. For those of you not familiar with opium's it's a drug similar in effect to heroin or to OxyContin or fentanyl. They're all related, highly addictive, destructive drugs. So anyway, so the British found a workaround. They would smuggle opium in to China using native Chinese drug runners. They would anchor off the coast of China and some of these ports, have native Chinese drug runners come in. The drug runners would pay in silver, and then the British would use the silver that they got from the Chinese drug runners to buy tea. And so in this way, they would, in essence, be trading opium for tea. All right, they wouldn't have to siphon off all of their silver that way. Well, naturally, this caused a big epidemic in China. It wasn't long before Chinese authorities realized what was going on. And they went out and they seized the opium supplies of the British who were anchored and who were hiding it in Chinese ports. Well, this caused an uproar in Great Britain. Not only were the Chinese being unfair by not doing free trade, by restricting British access to their markets, but now they were destroying British property by dumping their opium into the ocean. Well, this led to war between Great Britain and China. These wars became known as the Opium Wars, and it was a real shock for the Chinese. The British had been industrializing, and they now had steam-powered ships. They had modern cannons. And to the dismay of the Chinese, the British were able to easily destroy them, destroy their navy. British ships could go up Chinese rivers and fire into the interior. And a series of wars would come out of this in the mid-19th century, known as the First and Second Opium War, and then devastating rebellions that broke out in China afterwards, very much weakening the Qing dynasty that was then on the throne. And the Qing were forced to essentially grant access to not only the British, but other European powers, and America too, to begin to sell opium, but also other goods. So they essentially lost control over stopping foreigners from coming in and dictating the terms of trade to them, which was going to ultimately destabilize the Qing dynasty. Similar things were afoot in Japan. Japan had been even more restrictive to foreign trade than China had been. China at least allowed some of it, although albeit in very controlled manner. But Japan had more or less completely cut themselves off from all things international. They'd had some bad experiences early on with Portuguese Jesuits and Christian missionaries, and they decided way back in the early 1700s that they weren't going to be doing, maybe even earlier, might have actually quite a bit earlier, 1600s, they had decided they weren't going to do trade with virtually anybody. And so they completely isolated themselves. They didn't know much about what was going on in the rest of the world, nor did the rest of the world know much about what was going on in China. Other than that, it was a large market, and as free trade ideology began to dominate not only Britain, but really Europe and North America as well, many policymakers really wanted to begin to penetrate this Japanese market, not only for their raw materials, but also as a potential source to unload manufactured goods to. And so the country that took it upon themselves to force Japan open was the United States. They sent over Commodore Perry in the 1850s, a American naval commander. He had some new steamships, some new guns, and initially the Japanese were resistant, but Perry did a big demonstration out in Tokyo Bay off of Yokohama, and basically showed the Japanese the power and the might of modern weapons. And so while the Japanese came out with samurai swords, they were very much impressed by the power of this new technology. And after much deliberation, Japan announced that it was going to open up. Although we get the impression this was very much coercion. And so, much like in China, the United States and then other European powers imposed what became known as unequal treaties. They basically stipulated that Americans and others would get preferential treatment. They would be able to unload their manufactured goods into Japan, but that the Japanese would be, well, they wouldn't have to reciprocate. In other words, they wouldn't have to buy Japanese goods necessarily. They also worked out some special arrangements where their own people who were in Japan wouldn't be tried by Japanese law. If they did something wrong, they'd be tried by American or British or French law. And this was seen as quite humiliating by the Japanese, and they soon began to adopt industrialization themselves. But for the meantime, they were stuck having to import a bunch of foreign goods. Okay, so this is industrialization's effects in East Asia and some selective cases. And this is largely happening in the early part of the 19th century up until the 1850s, 1860s. But then the second industrialization, the second industrial revolution really begins to intensify, and this kicks things into high gear. So we now have chemical, we now have steel industries, and so aside from cotton, we have a whole bunch of new raw materials that we need to get. Many of these could be found in Africa and in non-Western countries. Things like rubber, which is a tropical product, palm oil, used in industrial manufacturing, but again is tropical, petroleum, not found in great quantities in Europe, but increasingly important for industrialization. And this was all happening simultaneously when Europeans were also gaining more and more technological advantage over these parts of the world. So not only did they need the raw materials of the rest of the world, but Europe was increasingly outpacing the rest of the world in its ability to get those things. And so the steamship had been invented. The Europeans could, with metal-hulled ships, could travel faster. They could go up rivers now that had previously been impenetrable. They now had sophisticated weapons, early machine guns, rifles, breech-loaded rifles. Medicine was also advancing, and so tropical diseases like malaria could now be treated. And so many of the things that had limited or hindered Europeans were now increasingly not a factor. At the same time, they needed to get to these places. Another factor that was driving Europeans toward colonization was increasing national rivalries among the Europeans themselves. At a time when countries were jockeying for position and flexing, colonies were a sign of prestige. And they were often seen as a way to redress balances of power. And so as these rivalries increase, if your rival like Germany, once it destroys the French army in the Franco-Prussian War, France feels like it's been diminished, and so there's more of an urge to get colonies to make up for the difference. Many countries start to see overseas colonies as a way to get ahead, get an advantage on a rival. You certainly didn't want to fall behind. Obviously, you wanted access to industries, raw materials. You didn't want a rival to corner the market on some important industrial product by seizing colonies first. Having strategic locations around the globe was recognized as necessary to secure trade and prosperity. And so as national rivalries heat up, there's even more of an urge to go to other parts of the world and start to colonize and seize raw materials. This is also going alongside some cultural sorts of things that are going on at the time. In our last lecture, we talked about some of the moral justifications for colonization. Social Darwinists tended to believe that European civilization was superior, that the advantage that Europeans had economically and politically and militarily was a sign of their own mental, physical, moral fitness, whatever the case was, and that other peoples were weak because of some sort of a natural defect on their part. And so the idea was that going to foreign parts of the world wasn't immoral, but it was the moral thing to do to, at the very least, spread European culture and technology to people that they regarded as savage, and to help them, we'll do air quotes there, to help them along and remake them in a European sort of image. Social Darwinists were teaching the survival of the fittest. They were postulating racial hierarchies. At the same time, Christian missionaries were anxious to spread Christianity and to win souls. And so whether it was because of social Darwinism or Christian missionaries or economic greed, many of these ideas can be summed up in the paternalistic attitude of the white man's burden. This was based off of a poem by Rudyard Kipling, the guy who did the Jungle King, the Jungle Book, excuse me. And basically the idea was that in this poem stresses that it's the white man's burden to go out to civilize the world. It casts it in almost like duty that you don't really want to do, but you have to do, and that ultimately these poor peoples out there were going to thank you, and you had to go and civilize them and sacrifice. So obviously a pretty condescending, paternalistic way of looking at the whole thing, and one that, to be fair, a lot of people saw through. But the point is, it was a popular ideology. And so one of the main targets was Africa. And it may surprise people that by 1850, very little of Africa had actually been colonized. One would think that perhaps this would be one of the earliest areas to be colonized because it's right next to Europe and um, easy access, but it really wasn't. And the reason is because it was hard to colonize Africa. It wasn't because people didn't try, but for one, the Sahara Desert was there, biggest desert in the world. The rivers of Africa all flow in the wrong direction. They flow out of Africa. There was dense jungle and forest in various regions. But probably the biggest reason was microbial, was the fact that Africa had diseases that would often kill explorers, diseases like malaria. And so Europeans early on didn't quite understand it, but they knew that once they got into the jungles of Africa, it was often a matter of weeks before they would die. And so the interior of Africa in particular remained a mystery. It was often called the Dark Continent. And that was more owing to the fact that Europeans just didn't really know what the interior looked like right up until the 1850s. Now, to be fair, Europeans had begun to make some inroads in North Africa, which has a more Mediterranean climate. Along the coast, for centuries, Europeans had set up little bases for early on for slave trading. Southern Africa had been colonized first by the Dutch and then by the English. And so there was a presence, but only about 10% of Africa had been industrialized. But that began to change during the 1850s as metal-hulled ships began to allow them to access some of these rivers. Medicine had advanced to the point where malaria could now be treated in. Now there was a gigantic incentive to go in and to begin to colonize as well, principally for raw materials, but also for the purposes of missionaries or just to acquire territory. So there was a lot of pressure now to do that. And so this set off a type of a gold rush as various European powers began to try to seize territory in Africa, so much so that it had the potential to lead to war among the European powers. And so Otto von Bismarck stepped in with the Berlin Conference. He invited all the European powers, and they attempted to set up rules. The Berlin Conference was in 1884, 1885. It is worth mentioning that no Africans were invited to the conference to give their opinions on these rules, but the rules were effectively that one needed to have an effective occupation. In other words, you couldn't just point at a map and say it's mine. You actually had to have boots on the ground and be in the process of setting up some sort of a government there. And so the idea of this was to just prevent countries from willy-nilly pointing to places and claiming it, and thereby leading to war. But it actually had the opposite effect. If holding a territory or getting claims to a territory was about having boots on the ground, this encouraged Europeans to quickly rush in and claim as much of Africa as they could before another country got there. And so this led to, within a 20-year period, almost the complete colonization of Africa, with the exception of Ethiopia, which managed to fight off the Italians who tried to conquer it, and Liberia, which wasn't conquered because of U.S. intervention there. But essentially, all of the continent is going to be colonized, as Europeans really just flood into the area and claim different areas. Oftentimes the borders that Europeans imposed on these areas weren't native or indigenous in any way. Oftentimes they ignored existing ethnic and cultural boundaries, so peoples who had traditional rivalries would be lumped together into one state, causing ethnic tensions and worsening tribal relations. And the European powers would then go about creating new political entities. And so as these European powers began to claim these territories, they quickly got to work economically exploiting them. Now, I should mention that it is worth noting that slavery was technically illegal at this point. All European powers had outlawed slavery by this point, but in practice, a lot of the conditions on the ground were very much like slave conditions. So there was minerals to be extracted, there was agriculture to be exploited, and certainly human labor. The economies of many of the areas claimed were immediately reoriented toward the European power. So it's worth mentioning that a lot of these places had their own native economies where, they would grow their own food and have their own economic systems. These were very much upended. And oftentimes, much of the land would be cleared and put toward a European cash crop. So this might be coffee, or it might be cocoa, or it might be some cash crop that you're going to, a commodity that you're going to sell, or it might be rubber plantations or palm oil plantations. And this very much made these countries dependent on the European mother country, right? So for instance, if there was an industrial collapse back in Belgium, then the Belgian Congo, the part of Africa that they had claimed that was doing rubber production or whatever, would collapse even worse, right? And so it very much tied these countries and their economies directly to the European parent. It also made them dependent on global commodity markets as well, right? And in many places, various types of coercive labor was used. The Belgians get a particularly bad reputation, Belgian Congo, keeping up with quotas that were demanded, mutilating people, cutting off hands and feet for people who were too slow producing goods. And so there's a lot of terror and exploitation that went along with this. Naturally, in many places, people also resisted these incursions. And so these led to many colonial wars. And so obviously these wars usually went well for Europe, not always, but usually went well for the Europeans with their sophisticated weapons, and oftentimes they were fighting tribesmen, sometimes using machine guns against people who were coming equipped with wooden weapons, and so led to massive slaughter. And also the suppression of local customs, traditions, and languages, which were quickly replaced with European models. And so once areas had been pacified sufficiently, colonial administrators would then come in and they would begin to implement a European colonial system. All right, so usually some colonial official will go in and directly implement colonial rule. This was the favorite model, direct control by the French. So the French would go in and just appoint a European governor who would essentially govern the colony. The British, on the other hand, preferred indirect rule, so working through a local chieftain who was a stooge of the British. They found this more effective. But whether it was direct rule or indirect rule, the laws that were implemented, the education, the culture was all European and for the benefit of Europeans. Europeans began to build the economic infrastructure that would be necessary to effectively exploit these places. This would include building railroads. One of the biggest railroads was planned by the British. It was going to go from South Africa all the way to Egypt, two of their colonies. This would make it easier to remove raw materials that were needed. It would also enable them to get troops to restive places easily. Oftentimes railroads were designed so that they would go directly to mines or plantations or rubber production areas. And so in other words, they were really geared, the infrastructure was really geared to getting things out of Africa rather than necessarily connecting the continent itself. This colonial administrators also began to culturally impose themselves on the natives. Oftentimes this would be done through schools, colonial schools, sometimes run by missionaries, sometimes run by secular authorities. And these schools would begin to train natives in a European educational environment with the goal of producing the next level of low-level officials for the colonial administrator. So the goal was that the top and important positions would be held by whites and Europeans, but that on the local level, these people who had been trained would act as the go-betweens. With the opening of Africa, missionaries also began to flood into the country, oftentimes, though not always, linked with the colonial government, and they began to convert and also assimilate. So the two weren't completely unrelated. The idea was that when somebody was converted to Christianity, that culturally they would become more assimilated into European ways. And obviously European languages began to replace and supplant native languages in many places. European languages for locals was the way to get ahead, and both in education, trade, administration, and local languages and cultures diminished as a result of that. And so by the dawn of the 20th century, Africa had been thoroughly colonized and was undergoing a big educational and cultural transformation. Similar things, though to a lesser degree, were happening around the rest of the world. Imperialism was increasingly impacting Asian society as well. We've already mentioned the British in India, the American opening of Japan, and the Opium Wars as a route to open China. Well, this just continued onwards. The British and French began to move into Southeast Asia. The British into Burma, the French, we mentioned, into Indochina, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, the Dutch into Indonesia. And European powers also began to vie with each other over China. So China was technically still ruled by the Qing dynasty, but after the Second Opium War, it had really lost its sovereignty. And European powers began to essentially create spheres of influence, which were a type of pseudo colony. Even the U.S. began to enter into the fray after the Spanish-American War, seizing the Philippines. So post-Spanish-American War, the U.S. seized the Philippines from Spain. Though technically committed to a free trade policy, they also began to intervene in Latin America at this time. Big parts of places like Central America became economically dependent on the U.S., like the Dole Corporation in Central America selling bananas, and basically, though not technically a colony of the U.S., economically making it an economic colony of the U.S., and they were very much involved in other places in Latin America. Well, as the European powers and the U.S. began to carve up the globe for themselves, by the late 20th century, by the early part of the 20th century, very little was left of the globe to carve up. And so this outlet of channeling your aggressions toward other places was increasingly no longer an option. China had been carved up. Africa had been carved up. There was very little left of the world to carve up. Furthermore, in an effort to seize as much territory as possible, Europeans had engaged in a massive arm race to improve their militaries, to fend off rivals, and to easily conquer places, and that was coming to a head. And so, with no further place to channel their aggressions with these large militaries, Europeans began to increasingly look at each other in the early part of the 20th century as tensions continued to ratchet up, but now without that outlet. We're going to see that these tensions are ultimately going to lead to World War I, but we should also remember that the legacies of this rapid colonization of Africa and other places was going to lead to future resistance movements as the 20th century began to unfold, and also long-term conflicts within the countries that had been colonized. Even after many of these countries got their independence, they were still economically tied to the mother country in many ways, since their economies had been very much converted into cash crops. And the ethnic tensions and economic dependency was going to be a long-term consequence of this period of time, right into the later part of the 20th century and even into the 21st century. Okay. What I'd like you to do is to answer this question on the new imperialism. How did the late 19th century surge in imperialism, particularly the scramble for Africa, reshape political dynamics, economics, and societies? And what are its enduring legacies?